Now, when we work with non-ordinary state, we get access, in addition to all these other mechanisms that are available in verbal therapy, we get access to many, many new mechanisms of healing. One of them, on the biographical level, is, for example, full reliving of traumatic events in age regression, where in verbal therapy we have to try to remember or indirectly reconstruct. In non-ordinary states, we relive in full regression, and we can directly express the emotions and the physical feelings, such as pain, nausea, choking, and so on, associated with some of these experiences. The other thing on the biographical level, which can have very therapeutic consequences, is reliving of some traumatic experiences which were physical in nature. These are not part of psychoanalytic thinking. For example, we find out that the person might have had experiences of near drowning, experiences of physical injuries, experiences of operations, childhood diseases, and so on, that simultaneously were also psychotraumatic, and reliving of the emotions and the physical sensations from this time can be extremely therapeutic. Now, it is not part of traditional thinking in psychotherapy, and even if it were, there's nothing that we can do using words. There's no way we can sort of work through the traumatic memory of near drowning just talking about it. Now, there are additional powerful mechanisms that become available on the perinatal level, which is primarily the reliving of the birth process, going through the experience of psychospiritual death and rebirth. And many different symptoms can be alleviated or resolved through experiences on that level. But there are also many new therapeutic mechanisms which become available on the transpersonal level. For example, I have seen a number of situations where a problem would survive somehow the work on the biographical level and even the perinatal experiences, and would be resolved in connection with a powerful past life experience. Or in some other situations, a problem would be resolved when the person allows himself or herself to identify with some archetypal figure. Or in some other instances, allowing, for example, a demonic archetype to come back. And the session then can look almost like exorcism. In some instances, part of the healing might happen in connection with identification with animals and even plants. For example, part of violence and aggression can be worked through in connection with an experience of becoming a black panther or a wolf or something like that. Having a very authentic identification with these animals. Now, this process typically would be, again, guided by the inner healer, by the inner radar. I would like at this point to give a few examples of such healing mechanisms, sort of remembering concrete clients, the problems that they had and how they were resolved. And you'll see that in most instances, the healing happened in connection with mechanisms that we couldn't possibly anticipate. There's no theoretical framework that would suggest that that particular experience could be healing for that particular disorder. So the first story I'd like to mention was a story of a psychologist and a minister from Australia who came to our 5-day workshop at SLM. And during the introduction, told us that he was really tortured by chronic pain in his shoulder, that he had repeated examinations. They couldn't ever find anything on the x-rays, and he had a lot of therapy, including cocaine injections and so on. And they would just bring release for a few hours, and then the pain would come back. And nothing up to that point had helped. And we started the breathwork session, and as the music came, he started screaming that the music was killing him and he couldn't stand it and he wanted to run out. And we went to him and we somehow convinced him to stay. He said, it's not the music killing you. Obviously, the music is bringing up some material that has to be looked at. And he went through a very powerful session that lasted several hours, where he was constantly in pain. He was sort of crying and screaming and shaking, and then got into a state where he was extremely relaxed and was in kind of a blissful condition after about 3.5 hours. And when we did the sharing, when he was talking about his experiences, he said that there were 3 levels of traumas that he discovered as the material which was underlying that symptom. At first, he experienced a situation where he was about 7 years old, and he was playing on a sand beach in Australia. And his other kids, they made a tunnel in the sand, and he kind of crawled in, and as the other kids were jumping around, the whole thing collapsed and buried him. And then the adults came and dug him out, and he was almost dead. He was completely blue. So that was one of the levels, the heaviness resting on him and the choking. The nature of the experience changed, where there was still pain, discomfort in the shoulder, but suddenly he realized that he was not in the sand anymore, that he was stuck in the birth canal with his shoulder behind the pubic bone of the mother, and again, pain in the shoulder and choking. And he stayed there for quite a while, sort of processing it, screaming, crying, shaking, choking, and so on. And then the nature of his movements changed, where they were kind of jolting movements, contracting movements, again with a lot of screaming and crying. And at this time, the experience was that he saw himself in a battle, in a uniform on a horse, and he actually identified that this must have been a battle in Cromwell's England. And at one point, he got a lancet through the shoulder, and he fell off the horse and was trampled by the other horses, and then experienced himself as dying. At first, the pain in the shoulder, choking on blood and the dust and so on, and then had the experience of dying and his consciousness detaching from the body, and from above he saw his trampled body sort of lying on the battlefield, and then consciousness moved from there and came into the present moment, and this was the end of his pain. We became friends, and we have seen him a number of times since, and the pain never came back. So that was one extreme situation. The other one was a woman who came to our SLN workshop, and she had had chronic depression for about 4 years. It was very difficult for her to get up in the morning, brush her teeth, comb her hair, and so on. It took her about 2 hours every morning before she really got going. And she did a couple of sessions, which were very powerful sessions, mostly going to some childhood material and then to birth. And then the day after the second session came into the group and was very, very charged and uncomfortable. And, we had in plans to do some talking, but this required some kind of instant attention. So we asked her to go into the middle of the room, lie down, and just go with the energy, with the shaking, and see where it takes her. And she again went back into birth with a lot of struggling and screaming and choking. And then at one point we found out that the sounds that were coming out had a different quality. It almost sounded like words. And so we told her to pay attention and let the sounds come through exactly the way they want to come. And at that point, it became very, very clearly a language that sounded like some kind of incantation or some kind of prayer. And then she ended up sitting up and made very kind of broad, wide movements with her arms, like she was in adoration of something. And she kept chanting sort of a repetitive sequence of words. And this took quite a while. And then it quieted down, and she lay back and was, in absolute ecstasy. And we had in the group a man who was a psychoanalyst from Argentina who was Jewish, and he came to us and said, "This is incredible, this is fantastic. Do you understand what happened?" And we said, "No." And he said, she was singing in perfect Sephardic, or Ladino, which is a medieval mixture of Jewish and Spanish, very much like Yiddish is a mixture of Hebrew and German. So it's a pretty esoteric kind of a language. But this man was a Jewish intellectual, and actually at one point had become fascinated, and he studied the Sephardic language, so he understood what she was singing. And we said, "What was she singing?" And he said, she was singing, "I am suffering and I will always suffer. I am crying and I will always cry. I am praying and I will always pray. So she did this for, I think, probably half an hour. When we asked her, she had absolutely no idea. She didn't know ordinary Spanish. She didn't know what Sephardic language was. Yet, these were the sequences that resolved her depression. This was exactly what she needed. And again, we have seen her several times since. And this was really a resolution of her depression.